Is a story about a very strange society. So back in the 1930s, there's this guy named Barney Josephson. He's the son of Latvian immigrants, and he's working as a shoe salesman in New York City, and he's a huge fan of jazz. But Barney finds that there's a problem with being a jazz fan at this time because all the clubs in New York City are segregated, and Barney knows that the best jazz musicians are black. So Barney decides he's going to open his own club that will be the first integrated jazz club in New York City. He scrapes together enough money to open up a club in a basement that will hold 200 people, and he calls his club Cafe Society. But unfortunately, business is bad. He's running out of money, and he realizes that he's going to have to move. But rather than admit he's moving for financial reasons, he tells the press that he's actually opening a new location because he's doing so well. And this actually works. It gets him so much attention that business starts picking up, and soon he finds himself actually running 2 successful Cafe Society clubs. So now with business booming, he's able to bring in a pretty big jazz star, this singer named Eleonora. Eleonora is only 23 at this time, but she's already an industry veteran. In fact, she's at kind of a low point in her career. She's feeling a little depressed, she's just left her most recent band, and she's had a bunch of hits, but she feels like she's been denied access to a mass audience. Eleanor Fagan was born in 1915. She was raised in Baltimore by her mother, who had been a teenager when she had her. She had an extremely difficult childhood, dealing with neglect and poverty and also sexual abuse. Eleanor skipped school so much that she was hauled into juvenile court at age 9 and sentenced to go to this Catholic reform school. There she was traumatized even further. One time, as punishment for her bad behavior, she was locked in a room overnight with a dead student. After 9 months there, she was finally released, and by the time Eleanor was 11, she had dropped out of school. She worked odd jobs like cleaning neighbors' houses and running errands at the local brothel. Although at the local brothel, she didn't want to be paid in money. Instead, she was paid in getting to listen to records. The madam at the brothel had a record player, which was a big deal for Eleonora, and she would sit there listening to Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith, and she started singing herself. By 1929, Eleonora and her mother had left Baltimore and were living in Harlem. And Eleonora, just a teenager, started singing in nightclubs all over New York City. And it was at one of these clubs in 1933 that a 17-year-old Eleonora Fagan was discovered by the producer John Hammond, who worked for Columbia Records. John Hammond loved Eleonora's voice and immediately signed her to Columbia Records to appear on a record with Benny Goodman. And so at just 18 years old, she made her recording debut. But not as Eleonora Fagan. Her father, who hadn't really been in her life much because he was making a living as a traveling musician, was named Clarence Halliday. But he used Holiday as a stage name, so Eleonora took that last name and took the first name of an actress that she really liked, Billy Dove.
Now I'd like you to know my favorite vocalist and America's #1 song stylist, Miss Billie Holiday.
After recording with Benny Goodman and recording some other songs on her own, she joined the big band of Count Basie and toured all over the country. In 1936, she was the first artist to have a pop hit with the song Summertime of Artie Shaw, which made her one of the first black women to be performing with a white orchestra. And touring with Artie Shaw's band really magnified the racism in America for Billie Holiday. In the segregated South, she wasn't allowed to use the same entrances as the rest of the band. She had to go through the kitchen. She couldn't sit at the bar with them. She couldn't eat with them. Audiences hurled racial abuse at her. And things weren't that much better outside of the South. There was an incident at the Lincoln Hotel in New York City where Billie was forced to use a service elevator rather than the regular elevator because white patrons of the hotel complained. That incident seemed to be the final straw for her, and she quit Artie Shaw's band. But that's when Barney Josephson asked her to start appearing at Cafe Society. But just performing there wasn't what changed the trajectory of her career. That was a song written by a guy who went by the name Lewis Allen. His real name was Abel Meeropol. He was a Jewish school teacher working in the Bronx, and he had written this poem. It was a poem about the horrors of lynching. He had actually published his poem in a Union teacher magazine. He had written it after seeing a famous photograph of 2 black men being hanged, and he had called it Bitter Fruit. Eventually he got the idea to set his poem to music, and the name was changed to Strange Fruit. It had been performed a little bit around New York City, but then Abel brought it to Cafe Society and got it to Billie Holiday. And at first she was really apprehensive. She didn't know if she could sing this song. It was a scathing political song full of brutal, vivid imagery that was nothing like anything that was being played on the radio in 1939. She said she wasn't sure, and Abel went home, but by the end of that night, she told the members of her band, "Some guys brought me a hell of a damn song that I'm gonna do." The first time Billie Holiday performed Strange Fruit at Cafe Society, she cried while singing it, and the audience didn't know how to react. They'd never seen anything like it. It was so powerful. People associated with Billie would later say that they saw her perform the song countless times, and it was unforgettable every time. She would close the show with it, and Barney Josephson would make sure that during this song, there was no service going on, no drinks were being served. It was totally silent and totally dark. All the lights were out except for one light on Billie Holiday's face. She would sing the song, tears would stream down her face, and then she would leave the stage. When the lights came back on, she was gone. No encores, no bows, just let the audience sit with what they just heard. Now they knew they had to record the song, but John Hammond and Columbia didn't want to go anywhere near it. They thought it was too controversial, that it would anger the South too much, but there was this guy, Milt Gabler, with a smaller record label called Commodore Records, and Columbia agreed to let Billie Holiday go record for him. When the song was released, it was indeed very controversial. It was banned from most radio stations, especially in the South, but it became a big hit. It was the equivalent of a top 20 hit and eventually sold 1 million copies. It was the biggest hit of Billie Holiday's career, and it made her a star. In a New York Post article in October of 1939, they wrote that if the anger of the exploited ever mounts high enough in the South, it now has its anthem. And people did use it as an anthem. At the time, the NAACP was trying to combat the problem of lynching. They were trying to get a federal law passed that would ban it. But every time they did, Southern white supremacist congressmen would filibuster to block it. And actually, as part of the strategy to get the law passed, people were encouraged to send copies of Strange Fruit to their congressmen. By the way, they did eventually make lynching a hate crime under federal law in 2022. Billie Holiday went on to have plenty more hit songs, but none with as enduring a legacy as Strange Fruit. In 1959, she talked about how she was still singing this song after 20 years. She said it was really painful to her, and it was personal because the song always reminded her of how her father died. Her father was a World War I veteran who had been exposed to mustard gas while overseas, and he developed a lung problem. While he was on tour in Texas, he got really sick and he went to the hospital, but they refused to see him because he was black. He finally was able to get treatment at the Jim Crow ward of a veterans hospital, but by that time it was too late and he died. Billie said, "It reminds me of how Pop died, but I have to keep singing it. Not only because people ask for it, but because 20 years after Pop died, the things that killed him are still happening."